They said I'd never have to go back. They told me I was safe, that it could never hurt me again. Well, they were wrong. Because today I'll be reading scary stories from California. Look, people give California a lot of crap, but you know what? They're part of America, darn it. They're just as much our brothers and sisters as Nebraska. You're welcome, Nebraska. So enjoy these allegedly true scary stories, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. At the moment, I'm looking for new trucker stories. Also, don't forget to follow and rate our newest shows, Destination Terror about haunted places, and Tales from the Break Room, which is about scary work stories. You can find them on Spotify, Apple, and your favorite podcast app. Now, let's begin. Unknown Creature from Anonymous. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I lived in the Newport Beach area in California, in a nice little neighborhood with my parents. My room was on the second floor and faced out into the street and towards the other houses. It had a slight view down the street. I sadly don't recall why my shades and curtains weren't closed that night, or what woke me up from a dead sleep, but I do know that I shot up wide awake in the middle of the night. I crawled across my bed to lower my shades and to pull my curtain closed when a dark shape caught my attention. I looked down at this dark mass moving up the street. Now, maybe it was because I was young and the logic of hiding behind anything made me feel safer, but I ended up hiding just behind my curtain. I was on the second floor though, and I probably couldn't be seen from where it was on the street. As it drew closer and closer, I noticed it looked weird, kind of like a brown hyena, due to what appeared to be the telltale long-haired coat and pointed ears. But that couldn't be possible. They aren't indigenous to California, so how did one wind up here? However, once it was across the street from my house, its legs seemed longer than normal, and its neck seemed a little too long. In fact, all of its proportions all seemed wrong. Eerily, it made no sound as it walked, too. Every once in a while, though, it would stop to sniff something here and there. Suddenly, it turned into the brush in front of my neighbor's house, and with no noise, it entered into them silently. I must have strained my eyes for another 10 or 15 minutes after it entered the bushes, trying to see if it would hop up on a wall or reappear. But the thing is, I never saw it come back out. All I can think of is maybe it escaped somehow from the San Diego Zoo, but that's a 45-minute to an hour drive south of the old house, and there were no mentions on news reports of an escaped animal. At the same time, I don't think such an animal could make it that far up the coast without being seen by someone. If you have any idea what this was, it would be very helpful. If not, I guess it's just one of the many mysteries of this world. My traumatizing encounters with a murderer. From Cody. Back then, I was 8 years old and living in California. I'm here to tell you that some people are freaks. This happened in my hometown, which I won't name here for privacy reasons, but I will say it's a small rural town in California near the Oregon border. One day I was walking back home from my school, which was about a 10-minute walk from where I lived. As I said, I was 8 years old, and I never thought anything bad would happen in a small town like that. Everyone knew everyone, or so we thought. As I walked, a white van with no windows or license plate. I was a very attentive kid. The man inside the van said he was new to town and asked me where he could find the local Walmart. For reference, the local Walmart was about 50 minutes away. So I told him the nearest one was in another town about an hour away, and I told him the name of the town. At that, the man seemed angry. He then got out of his truck and asked me if I was giving him sass, because he was sure this was the right town. I was always a pretty shy kid, so this was a huge red flag for me. I ran home crying, and my mother asked me what happened. I told her and she called the police, But of course, they could do nothing, nor did they really care about some strange man yelling at me. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time I saw him. The next encounter is when I was walking with my friends to go get some ice cream from our local candy shop. We were walking together when that same white van pulled up, but this time it did have license plates, so at first I didn't think it would be the same man driving it. Until, that is, he stepped out, asking us if we wanted some candy. My friend, David, who had always been a smart aleck, said, "There's a candy shop right up the road, so we're good." At this, the man, like before, got angry, and he began to yell at us, but this time, he demanded that we get into his van. When we didn't comply with this order, he chased us and we ran away. I never understood why, but he never got back into his van to chase us with it. He always ran after us on foot. The three of us split up and ran into the woods. The road we were on, there was woods on either side of us. He singled me out because he must have recognized me from before. I decided I'm done with this and began running towards my home. From there it would be a 2-minute run. He kept on chasing me all the way up to my house, and when I got to my house, my mom and dad were home, thankfully. I ran in hysterical, and my mother asked what happened. I told her it was the same man, and I explained what happened this time. My father ran outside and confronted the man. My father is 6'5" with a bulky build, and he was muscular back then, not someone you wanted to mess with, not to mention he had a military background. The man immediately tried to run away upon seeing my dad, but my dad easily caught up with him, threw him down on the ground, and held him until the police came. They arrested the man, and, as it turns out, the guy was wanted for murder, kidnapping, and other things of a little girl. He was convicted, and I never saw him again. I'm so glad that he didn't catch me or any of my friends, or we could have been his next victim. I still get anxiety attacks from strangers approaching too fast or someone moving too suddenly towards me. Just from the thought of what could have happened, I never learned his name, and I will never care to. To be honest, I just want to put this behind me. Paper Bag Creep. From Anonymous. It was a dark and stormy night, which made the morning dreary and thick with California coastal fog. But it was the last day of summer my sophomore year back in 1987, and like heck was I going to waste it sitting at home listening to the 1000th repeat of my little sister's favorite song, Caribbean Queen. So I called up my best friend, who we called Bunny back then, which is a John Cusack movie in-joke. His car was broken down again, so we planned to time our ride on the city bus, so he could catch the same bus 8 miles from my house. I usually sat in the middle row near the back entrance and loved to rest my knees up on the seat in front of me. Then I would just stare through the cloudy, scratched plastic windows. Plus, the reflection in the smoky tinted plastic reflected the interior, and I could covertly watch the other passengers while pretending to enjoy the outside view during the 15 to 20 minute ride. When I boarded and sat down, I noticed a guy in a monk's brown robe sitting in the back row. His Coke bottle glasses obstructed my judgment as to which direction he was staring, but if I had to guess, it did seem like he was looking at me. Only natural, right? As I was currently the closest person to him on the bus. Just people watching, I assumed, as I would do that too. I'd seen the dude before as well, walking along the curvy mountain roads, panhandling downtown, and sometimes at the beach. I guess you could call him a local weirdo. Another of California's fruits and nuts. A few miles in, he got up and sat across from me, nearer the door, so I figured he was getting off soon. He'd angled himself to look straight at me though, and I hated being social, so to avoid conversation I kept my nose to the window, glancing back to keep an eye on him as he repeatedly clutched and crumpled the rolled edge of a noisy paper shopping bag. Finally, Bunny boarded the bus and noisily sat next to me. He then happily let me know that his poop that day looked like deer poop. That's how Bunny was sometimes. No filter. But this did crack me up. and I momentarily forgot about the monk dude. Everyone left the bus at the main station, and Bunny and I spent a few hours perusing the local outdoor mall and all the tourist junk stores. Then we headed back to the station, intending to take the next bus into a neighboring town for some food. Waiting for the bus to arrive, Bunny asked me not too quietly, "Hey, do you know that dude? He's been following us this whole time." On the other side of the big triangle-shaped planter, the monk was apparently unpacking his paper bag. I watched him carefully refold some clothing, towels, and some other things, arranging them on the concrete bench. I laughed and said, "The creeper likes you, pretty boy." But Bunny looked worried. "He keeps unpacking and packing that bag every time we stop to look at the stuff. It's weird. I think I saw a knife in there too," he explained. I then noticed that a bus that would take us halfway to the next place was here already. "Let's just take 69 right now," I said. "All right, let's go," he agreed. We ran across the station and boarded the bus. The bus sat there waiting for other passengers, and we nervously watched the monk slowly pack up his things again, and he came onto our bus. We sat in our usual middle seat and the monk sat behind us, so we couldn't really watch him this time as we rode to the next station at another mall in silence. When we got there, we left the bus and slowly walked into the main entrance to the mall. The monk was a bit behind us, so as soon as we got through the doors, we ran around in a loop to the other entrance, boarding our connecting bus into the next town, laughing and bragging about how we had ditched that dude at last. It wasn't long until those smiles fell right off our faces, because that monk creeper boarded our bus and glared at us as the bus started up. He sat near the rear entrance. We were trapped. The bus hit a halfway point at the local college, and with a press of about 40 college students, we got off the bus and went to a payphone in a little store by the bus stop. The monk was standing just outside the glass, packing the bag again, but pressing the big kitchen knife into the folded stuff until the edges raised up from the pressure on the items. He was staring at us, but we were sure he couldn't hear us from there. Bunny called our friends one by one, and even our parents, but either they all didn't take it seriously or they were busy. We only had 1 quarter left, so we called a kind of gangster friend of ours named Shamu, who had a car. We pleaded with him and promised him all kinds of stuff like Bunny's new bike and homemade cookies until he agreed with our plan. So we hung up and waited for the next bus. The monk was getting twitchy and began mumbling to himself as he packed his bag over and over. We got on the bus and took the 40-minute bus ride in silence up near the driver. The monk sat in the back, and every time his seat opened up he would move up to that seat, getting closer, all the while mumbling louder until he was shaking his head, gnashing his teeth, and almost yelling curses and prayer-like rants about Satan and how we were evil, and he was the devil and would take us to hell. Eventually, all the other passengers were staring at him, creeped out and confused too. At one point, when he moved seats, one lady that was sitting close to him pulled out a rosary and ran to a different seat, handling the beads. I'd had it with this bullcrap, telling the driver that this jerk had been following us all day, that he had a knife. I said we should call the police to come get him at the station. I'm not sure she believed me, but she did keep glancing back as he got louder and kept her eyes on him. He was only 3 seats away then, when we rolled into the station, so we booked it through the drizzly weather, across the station to the public parking area, looking for and screaming for Shamu. We cut across the busy street, with me almost getting hit by a delivery truck that clipped my backpack, sending me spinning to the ground. Bunny quickly grabbed my elbow and pulled me up. We went to the parking lot where Shamu had gotten out of his red VW Rabbit and was waving to us. We screamed at him to get in and to go, go, go as we crammed ourselves into the car. At this point, the monk was now stomping after us, screaming rants at us. At last, some security guards surrounded him, and Shamu peeled out of the parking lot and drove away. Shamu's face turned pale as he admitted, "I thought you guys were joking with me." "Yeah, no," I said. Bunny screamed out the window, "Screw you, you creep!" as we passed the now struggling, creepy monk wannabe. I'd like to say I never saw him again, but he was still around. I would stay very far away from him whenever I could. 20-odd years later, I've moved 2 states away. As time passed, Bunny died of a heart attack, and Shamu did a stint in prison. I recently saw a video of my hometown area, and he was there in the background. He was older and far away, but it still gave me deep chills down in my gut. That dude is still out there, free to fixate on someone else. Maybe you, maybe your kids. Creepy lights in the sky. From Anonymous. I'm a 16-year-old boy who lives in Chula Vista, California. It's a beautiful, decent-sized city located right near the Mexican border. The west side is by the bay, which has that salty aquatic water, while the east side, near where I live, smells like plants. It helps that it's closer to the mountains. Me and a few close friends were having a get-together at a boy's house. The boy's name was Jaden. It was getting dark, and it was winter, so it got dark even earlier. The sky was a light baby blue and was kind of orange, and the moon was a small crescent, which barely had any light shining down on us. We headed to the local park to go on a small adventure, which was less than a half a mile away. We had to cross a small canyon to get there. The canyon was not very wide, but was approximately the size of a football field. There were always coyotes and possums prowling about there, or mentally unstable men doing some very strong substances. After walking there with some friends for a bit, we returned to the top, which was near a street where cars would always speed by on. 3 of our friends were down in the cul-de-sac in our neighborhood, down a trail from the canyon. Me and my friends were walking up to the top. We then saw a white light fill up the sky towards the south. This was not a car. First of all, we didn't hear anyone pass by for about 5 minutes, and secondly, that type of light wouldn't be able to fill up the sky like that. So we thought it was a spotlight, but there were no structures in that direction that would project them, except mountains that would stretch for miles, and it was about 10 times brighter than a normal spotlight. Cece's phone was dead and kept turning on and off. That was creepy since it was a newer model iPhone. Then we saw a red light fill up the sky. It moved as a streak and vanished directly overhead. I started to get even more freaked out. What would be a logical explanation for this? There were no cars passing by, no spotlights or anything that bright. Plus, how would a red light light up the sky right after that as a streak? The red light was even brighter than the previous white one, not to mention the weirdness from Cece's mobile phone. A minute later, we met up with some friends who were down in the cul-de-sac waiting for Jaden to return, as he took care of some things at his house. They had seen the white flash of light, and also mentioned that they hadn't seen any cars. White and red can be construed as the colors of the head and taillights of automobiles, but as I said, no cars had passed by before, during, and after the encounter. My friend Wendell revealed he saw the red flash of light too. He said it was in the shape of a sphere. We went on with our night, trying to pretend nothing happened. Still, I do consider if what we saw was the work of extraterrestrial life forms. It makes me wonder if we're not the only intelligent things in the universe. Perhaps we'll never know what truly transpired that night. The Dust Man. From Anonymous. I'm surprised I can still recall this memory. I was about a 6 or 7-year-old girl at the time. I was in my old apartment in Temecula, California. My apartment was a really small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. My siblings and I would sleep in the master bedroom. We all slept in bunk beds on each side of the room. My sister and I slept on the right side of the bedroom on a gray bunk bed, and my 2 brothers slept on the left side of the room on the white bunk bed. The older siblings always slept on the top bunk, and I was one of them. Each of the beds had a window by them too. Now, I had just awakened from a nightmare about a zombie apocalypse in my apartment complex, which had for some reason occurred because we ran out of candy. A stupid dream, yeah, but whatever. It was about 2 a.m. I was facing the wall when I woke up. For the first time, I didn't feel tired right after waking up in the middle of the night. I rubbed my eyes and turned my body until I was facing the room. A blast of air had blew in my face when I turned around. I closed my eyes for a bit, but I couldn't fall asleep. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. I then looked at the window. Then my hairs stood up on my head. There was a figure staring out of my window, right by my bed. I could barely see it, but it was there. A tall human figure made of dust. It couldn't have been nothing. It was a distinct figure, a tall man who looked like he was at least 19 years old. He was wearing a long brown button-up shirt with a darker brown colored pocket. He had short, shaggy black hair, and he had baggy jeans with tears in them. I'm not sure how I remember all these details even now. After about 5 minutes, the figure began to move. The figure looked at me, then looked back at the window. He did that for a couple more minutes. I couldn't move. I was frozen in shock. I wanted to scream for my siblings, but I just couldn't get myself to do it. After a couple of minutes had passed, he just stared at me. He stared at me for so long. I was about to get up to run to my parents' room, but before I could get up, the figure floated up to my bed. He pushed me down and said in a very deep and groggy voice, "Bye, Mommy." Then he vanished. This is way creepier because I have a son, and he had just recently got into a car accident when his older friends were drunk driving. He'd been wearing the same clothes as that figure, and before he had left to go to his friend's house, he looked at me strangely, and he'd said, "Bye, Mommy," in the same sort of tone. I was shocked. It was like my own kid knew about the time I was 6 or 7, or perhaps the figure itself was a premonition. Another thing is, when my son was little, he used to stare out the window and look at me and look back. Plus, his first 2 words were Mommy and bye. So when he would look out the window, he would jump on me and say, "Bye, Mommy." Maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think so. Silhouette in the Forest, from Doge 69. I live in Northern California. A few months back, my brother and I decided to stay in our parents' RV. It was behind our small house at the edge of the woods. It was around 11 that night when things got creepy. I began to hear light footsteps around the RV and strange breathing. At first, I thought it was my mom or dad checking in on us. But after 10 minutes of the footsteps and breathing, I finally couldn't take it. I went to the back bedroom of the RV to tell my brother. But by the time I got there, I found my brother pale, scared, and lying on the floor, hiding. I tried to talk to him, but he shushed me. I then looked out the window, but I didn't see anything weird. The whole time, though, the forest was silent. I noticed then that the footsteps had stopped too. Not long after that, the normal sounds of the woods came back. I didn't think much of it at the time, and I went back to bed. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I shot up from my bed. I figured I'd had one of those dreams that make you wake suddenly. But then I realized the silence of the woods had returned. It was so silent all I could hear was the small creek a few yards from the RV. I looked around, trying to regain my senses. That's when I heard more footsteps. I thought about my brother, and the 2 of us trying to make a run for it back home. But I didn't know what would happen to us if we went outside. My brother had awakened too, and heard the sounds. When I went to the back bedroom to where he was, I saw something peek in through the window. You'd have to be the size of a man to do that. Whatever it was shadowy and dark. Terrified, I watched it run off into the forest. The 2 of us then stayed awake all night, and only when the sun was up did we book it back to the house. So much for a quiet shift. From Some Drummer Boy. I'm a Marine, and at the time of this story I was at 29 Palms, California for MOS school. If you don't know what it's like, it's a beach without an ocean. This happened about a week or so before my class was to graduate and be sent out to our new duty station. My roommates and I were among the 12 or so who were scheduled to be on fire watch at 2200 or 10 p.m. to 0200 2 a.m. To give a brief layout of the terrain, picture 4 3-story dorm-looking buildings, with 2 on a small hill and the other 2 at the bottom. Going to the left takes you to some class buildings, and to the right a small sandy portion of desert that leads to the medical side. To the rear is another set of barracks, and a tiny set of jagged sandy hills with a poorly lit road. Me and my battle buddy decided to patrol the bottom right barracks building because there was a table and bench that we could use to take a break at. There was a small fight that almost broke out that we had to stop. We left it in the hands of that particular class once everything was settled, and afterwards we thought that would be the highlight of our shift. We then began to patrol each floor, making sure everyone was secured in their room and that no one was out. As we were making our way through the second floor, we noticed that someone's door was open and made our way up to that room. I was about to inform the Marines inside about leaving their door open when I noticed what one of them had on their rack. It was a Ouija board. It was out and in the middle of being used. I instantly thought about how tonight was going to get weird, because I'm not crazy enough to mess with those things. I had to say something because we made eye contact with them. "Evening, gents, just wanted to let y'all know about not leaving the door open," I said. "Sorry guys, our door doesn't close all the way, but we'll use a chair to block it before we crash," he replied. "Tight, y'all be careful with that thing," I warned as I closed the door. I looked at my battle buddy and he said, "Well, tonight can't get any worse, I suppose." As soon as he said that, the light above us began to flicker, and I let out an annoyed sigh. It probably will. About 2 hours into our shift, we were back near the room with the Ouija board, talking about where we were from and the cryptids of our respective regions, when suddenly we both noticed something. There was another set of boots walking behind us, but there was no one outside the building, let alone the second floor. My battle buddy turns to me and asks, "Are you hearing what I'm hearing?" "Yeah, let's finish this lap and we'll swap out with the guys on the hill," I said. The footsteps stayed behind us until we left the vicinity of the building and switched out with our roommates. As we began walking around the quarantine area of the barracks, we greeted the female duty Marine when we passed by and began to make our way up the stairs. With about 15 minutes left of the shift, we were deep into talking about skinwalkers and wendigos while on the 3rd floor. We were about halfway across the walkway when suddenly we both heard what sounded like a woman screaming while being gutted. "What in the world was that?" my battle buddy exclaimed. "No idea, but it sounds bad. Let's move," I said as we began to book it towards the end of the building. We looked out over the railing, and there was no sign of anything bad. No blood or indicators of a struggle. Nothing that would require immediate attention. I told my battle buddy to provide me with security while I tried to take a closer look. I then noticed there was a minor disturbance in the sand. It looked as if someone had jumped then moved towards the hills. I gave this information to my battle buddy. Then he mentioned that the female Marine was downstairs where the scream had come from. We both began to sprint down the stairs to where she was at, only to find that she was still at her post, unharmed. "You guys all right?" she asked. "Well, did you happen to hear anything weird a moment ago?" I asked. She shook her head, then said that our shift was about to end, and we should make our way to formation. I motioned to my battle buddy to follow me to the assembly area, and once we were dismissed, we decided to briefly go back and inspect the tracks, but they were gone. We looked at each other, confused. "Let's head to bed," I said. "Not our problem anymore." And in case you're wondering if we were armed at the time, we were at student status, so we didn't have access to the armory, and only the road guards carried radios. It's all fun and games until you have Firewatch. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
So when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds, and I was at the park down the street from my house waiting for the school bus. Usually my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating on me, actually. And well, there was usually a few of us girls there waiting, but this day I was the only one there. So I sat down on the bench and I had one headphone in and one out so that I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me, and as I waited, a black Honda pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I just had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious by any means that I was watching it because I didn't want to look crazy, but after a few minutes, two big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and these guys were creeping me out. Of course, he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text on my cousin who was home. I lived with my aunt and my two guy cousins, who was unwinding down from his night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus that it was two men, but I didn't get any responses. When they got out of their car, they started to walk towards me, so I got up from the bench and walked towards the street because the bus was supposed to be there any minute anyway. The driver actually ended up being a little bit late as well, and as I stood by the street, these men walked up to me and I could just feel the bad energy. But one guy said hello as the other stood there staring me down. I just sort of did a small half smile and a nod and then looked away. And then the same guy, who I'll call number one, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number two, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. Then number one kept asking me yes or no questions, like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you live close by? Do you do drugs? We have some. Do you want some? And then two asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body, and I got the chills instantly. Two was quiet the whole time and started to tell me that they just got back from Russia, but the way he said it was just really creepy, almost intimidating, in fact. I knew that they were from somewhere else because they had strong accents, but I just couldn't pin the place. They kept telling me to get into their car because they have drugs. I just said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I was not stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. Then number one asked if I have a car. I said no, and that my bus is almost here. Sorry, I have to go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they asked me questions, but before the bus got to me, number one handed me a card and said that he has a car shop and to call him sometime if I need anything. He even stated that he'd give me a free car if I wanted. The card looked shifty, and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew that I needed that number on it to report it. So I took it, and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and picked me up, and as soon as I got on, I started to cry, and I just had a complete meltdown. It was like all of the adrenaline was keeping my mind and my body aware and focused while the men were there, but as soon as I was safe, my body and mind just gave out. Thankfully, There weren't that many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off, and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said that she saw them around me, but thought that I knew them because, well, they were so close to my person. The driver called into a dispatch saying that there was an incident so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick all the other students up, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office and I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did the campus security. They were really sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, their car, and even the questions the creeps asked me. I cried the whole time, and then I pulled out the card the guy gave me and handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said that he was going to call it and act like my dad, so he did. It was on speaker, and number 1 answered. I knew his voice as if it was burned into my brain at that point. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack as well. But the principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price, and the guy played dumb. The principal said that his daughter, me, gave him the card, and as soon as he said that, the guy just hung up. They tried calling again, and the phone was shut off, and then eventually disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and even the security as soon as the phone clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police and had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew that it was real, like my crazy story wasn't just made up. The principal eventually excused himself and the security guard as well, and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything that they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come and get her. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in and asked me for the story again, and in front of the principal and the security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me that it sounded like they were watching us girls at that park because they chose the one day that one of us was alone there. He also said that the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they wanted. I felt sick and I just couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that actually picked up first was my boyfriend, believe it or not. One of the officers talked to him as the other finally got a hold of my aunt, though. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I just cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, and aunt, my mum and my cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears, and the men were absolutely livid, but also worried for me. And a week later, some girl at another high school, not far from the park, was saved by other students. She was apparently being dragged into a black Honda by 2 guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of their car. The principal called me into his office, and that's actually how I found out. They also had the same officers there, and they even had me choose the 2 guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out quickly, and they were caught. And yes, it was in fact those same 2 guys that tried grabbing that second girl too, a freshman girl. Quite honestly too, I felt worried for her and sad that she went through worse than I did. But I must admit that I almost felt free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulder so often, because I couldn't believe that they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, and now ex, also took me some days. And I guess that I'm just thankful to be alive and well. And I am even more thankful that the girl was also saved by the courageous kids at her high school. So, I've timelined and tried to write everything down that I remember about these experiences to give me a bit of a guide when writing this. But it all started from when I was very young, and the first instance of this happening was when I was living with my grandmother. Her and I were very close. This will play in later. I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep with her to my right. There's no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep, only a few inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather asleep in his room. Then, Very clearly, and also really loudly, I hear my grandma call from the kitchen. It was almost as if she was calling me for dinner, it was that loud. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teen, and apparently when you hear your name being called this loud, you're supposed to reject it. I didn't at the time. Not knowing this, I just huddled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was probably around when I was 13 or 14, when my father took me on a family trip to Las Vegas. We visited some part of the Grand Canyon, and while my family was waiting in line for a skywalk bridge that we had paid a tour for, I wandered around the edge a good distance away from my family and decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded sort of distorted and almost like grandmother had yelled my name back. It may not have been my grandmother exactly, but it was eerily similar for some reason. Nevertheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't really put much weight into this particular experience because it might have just been my voice being thrown weird, but I just thought that I should mention it. But this next one happened when I was 13 or 14 as well. It's the most terrifying one that I've had, and every time that I tell this story to people, I start to cry or even tear up a bit. This is the closest that I've ever been to whatever this is, and proves my point that it's mimicking people that I care about. So I was on vacation with my family in Key West and had rented a home. I invited my best friend, who we'll call Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we had decided to skip out on the boating trip and mooch off of the house's owner's Netflix all day. On about the fifth episode of what we were watching, we decided on a snack refill and a bathroom break. So we paused the television and I make my way to the kitchen. I believed that Ash had followed me into the kitchen, I think, and leaned on the island while I prepared some chips with my back turned to her. I held a full conversation with her and even looked back at her on her phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind that I was talking and looking at Ash on her phone. She was even holding it in the specific way that Ash does. I turned my back for a split second to pick up the bowls and suggest that we head back to the couch when I see Ash, or the real Ash anyway, walk out of the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing that I asked her was how she got to the bathroom and in and out without me hearing it like that. She then gave me the weirdest look and told me that she'd been in there the whole time since we got up. This is where I start freaking out and insisting that I had just been talking with her and even physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and how maybe she was going to die. I quickly suggested that we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. She then informed me that she had gotten her period while she was in the bathroom the same time that I was talking to whatever I was talking to. And then we walked around until my mum called me that she was back in the house. We're still best friends to this day and have been for 11 years now. I asked her about it today before I wrote this as well, and she said that she didn't hear me talking with anybody at all the whole time that I was apparently out there. Now, at this point, you guys must think that I'm crazy, I know, but for this next one, I actually have a witness. Honestly, too, I felt like I was a little crazy after it happened with people who freaked out as much as me. But again, I was on vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, just a little west in Tennessee, though. We had our previous reservations cancelled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. We got there late at night, and the moment we all stepped out of the car, the first thing that we heard was a man's voice saying, "Hey neighbours," coming from a cabin to the left of ours that was higher up on the mountain that we were on. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, so we assumed that he could see us, but we just couldn't see him. Probably some guy on his balcony, right? Well, my friendly stepdad yelled a "hey," and he waved up towards the direction that it came from. It wouldn't have been that weird if this didn't happen every time that we stepped out of the cabin or the car, and my family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality that we're not used to in Miami. Retelling it though, my brother and my friends agreed that it was a bit weird. I did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night, and some outside my window too. It was a raised cabin, so probably a story or two off the ground. but I don't give it much thought since wildlife is a thing in the woods, and it's just something that I thought that I should mention. But the thing that really propelled me into researching what the heck was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin, and both my brother, sister, and I too heard something calling my name deeper into the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into full big sister protection mode, and almost threw them back into the little slope that we had to climb to get into the woods in the first place. We were all just crapping ourselves from how clear it was and how we all pinpointed it was coming from deeper in the woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was during the day too, and we were all so thrown by this that we just stayed in for the rest of our trip. We all agreed though that it was a woman's voice, and the first thing that I asked my mum when we got inside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I could take care of the younger ones just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were though, and we just didn't really go out at night for the rest of our trip. I think that I reacted so badly to this one mostly because, well, I had kids to take care of, and I could tell that they were terrified out there. Again though, the voice sounded like somebody was looking for me or calling for me back somewhere. With no knowledge of what this could have been though, I had finally decided to look into things when I turned 17. I had no previous knowledge of Wendigos or skinwalkers or anything cryptid, only ghost investigations and Zach Baggins making something out of a scratchy EVP or something like that. But to be quite honest with you guys, I'm just sort of desperate for answers now because at this point, I'm constantly thinking about it and driving myself into rabbit holes of information and myths and legends, just trying to figure it out. And if you've listened this far, thank you for listening. I know that I'm not the best storyteller and recounting may not be that good, but I was trying to get everything and all the details into a cohesive manner. But please, do let me know if you guys have any thoughts or ideas about what this all could mean. This story begins with my boyfriend. He had his foot operated on a few days prior to this, so he was still walking on crutches. We wanted to go to the city centre to hang out with some friends and get some drinks and whatnot, but since cycling wasn't an option because of the crutches, we live in the Netherlands, so basically we use our bicycles for everything. We decided to walk. We actually don't live that far out of the centre, about a 15-minute walk I would say, so it seemed like the most logical choice at that time. We left the centre around 2 in the morning. The way to our house is heavily populated and there are always people on the streets. This night, however, it was oddly quiet. We were about 5 minutes on the way when I spotted a guy on the opposite side of the street. He was looking at the shop windows, but also sort of keeping an eye on us. I suddenly felt very vulnerable, if that's the right word, considering my boyfriend was walking on crutches and me being quite small. I'm like 5 feet. The guy walked in the opposite direction, but then walked back again, doing this a few times. I tried to walk faster, but my boyfriend couldn't keep up, so we had to keep quite a slow pace. When all of a sudden, the guy crossed the road really quickly in a straight line towards us. I'm small but fierce, so I was ready to fight, when suddenly, around a corner, a homeless man just came walking towards us and the man. He was shouting and cursing to no one in particular. Apparently the homeless man had frightened the creepy guy so much that he immediately just ran away. We walked away as quickly as we could, and we kept looking back to see if this creepy guy had followed us, obviously, but we thankfully didn't see him again. I fully believe that the creepy guy had bad intentions, and maybe robbing us, maybe even worse. I'm not too sure, but I also believe that that homeless man, he saved us, intentional or not, and for that, I'll forever be grateful.
When my daughter was just 12 months old, we went on a trip to Hawaii. When we were first sitting in the airport, waiting to check in for our tickets, some random guy started commenting on how beautiful my daughter was. That wasn't exactly unusual. People consistently told us Anna was the cutest baby they'd ever seen, so I politely accepted the compliment and thanked the guy for his comments. But he didn't stop there. The guy kept getting closer and closer to her, asking me stuff like, how old is she? When is her birthday? What her favorite things are? Where we're headed? I started to feel slightly uncomfortable, but kept up the polite pretense because my husband would be back any second. Then the final straw was having the guy actually reach out and attempt to actually physically touch our daughter. I was like, hey, back off, mister. Then my husband came back and the man stepped away pretty quick. We then told airport security about the guy, but he'd apparently made himself scarce since the mood turned sour. Anyway, a few minutes later we arrived at our gate, only to see the exact same handsy guy waiting for us, apparently getting on the exact same flight. Airport security then caught up with the guy, but all they seemed to do was ask him not to hassle us again. After that, we got on the plane, only for the guy to position himself in a seat where all he had to do was look over his shoulder and he could see me and my daughter. Then, when my husband got up to use the bathroom, the guy ended up turning around and looking me in the eyes before saying in this childlike baby talk voice, "Guess who's found out where you're going?" We made a huge deal out of this, and the flight attendants took our side, moving the guy to another seat and telling him not to move. Upon landing, there were people waiting for him that he was forced to go with, security or airport staff, I don't know, but we didn't see him again. I can't say for certain what the guy had in mind for me and my daughter, whether he just liked harassing us or if he had something more sinister in mind. But I know for a fact that if it wasn't for my husband or for those flight attendants, things probably would have been way worse. That was also the day I realized that flight attendants aren't just servers in the sky. They go through a ton of training for how to handle different situations, one of which, oftentimes, is human trafficking, which they take very seriously. If you are ever in danger or you feel you're in danger while flying, speak to a flight attendant immediately. They can relay messages through the pilots and ATC and have police waiting to greet you right at the gate. This happened 9 years ago. I just ended a 4-year relationship and moved into an old building in downtown Paris. I had to start all over again from scratch. I did the mistake to let my ex-girlfriend keep a lot of my furniture, kitchen cutlery, pans, coffee machine, etc. At the time, I worked as a waiter, so I could only afford a one-room apartment from a council estate building. It was old and barely clean, but at least I had a roof. The first 2 weeks, nothing happened, but quickly I began to hear someone talk at night. It was mumblings. It basically said, "Go and die already. When I looked through the door, I saw a scrawny, shirtless guy smiling and scratching the door with his finger. That became a thing. Every 2 or 3 nights he came and threatened me through the door or sang songs with a childish voice. I might have opened the door and asked him what in God's name he wanted, but I was afraid he had a knife or something and I couldn't see his hands while looking through the door. What stunned me is that he acted totally normal when I stumbled upon him during the day and denied being the one who did that at night. I even got mad at him, but he seemed to genuinely not understand what I was talking about. One day I came home with a girl that I had met at the bar that I was working at. For some reason she left during the night and I went back to sleep. The mumbling started again, only this time it felt really close. I opened my eyes only to witness the scrawny neighbor headbutting the wall and singing what sounded like a mix between religious chants and a lullaby in slow motion. I was honestly paralyzed by fear. I tried to communicate with him, but he was just grinning and ended up exiting my apartment by himself. I decided to call the police that very night. They took him all right, and he went straight to the psych ward. Actually, this guy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and I guess had been in and out of the psychiatric hospital before. He wasn't supposed to live at his place anymore. He just ran from the hospital 2 months ago and they only reported it, but there wasn't much of an investigation from the police. He initially got sent into the psych ward after bashing a shovel into a postman's head, putting him in an actual coma. And he did it for absolutely no reason. I never saw him again, and I moved out 2 years after that. I grew up in a small beach town on the East Coast. It had that cliché suburbia vibe, complete with book clubs and block parties. My sister and I were close friends with our neighbors as well, as they had a daughter, Kristen, who was around our age. A lot of times we spent playing together in our shared yards, at the beach down the street, and our nearby park. It had been one summer day that my mom and Kristen's mom decided to take us to this particular park, and, as per usual, as soon as we arrived, Kristen, my sister, and I raced to the swing set to claim our seats. Our moms had followed leisurely behind us, looking ahead to see if they could snag a spot in the shade. Once they picked a picnic table, they sat down and set up. They were chatting and got some snacks ready for us, occasionally glancing over to make sure we hadn't fallen off the swings. The afternoon was going well. Everyone was having fun and enjoying the weather when Kristen's mom pointed across to where we were playing. There, instead of just 3 kids swinging, there were 4. Seems like the girls made a friend. She smiled at my mom, as they looked at the other girl who had just joined us. An older woman, possibly her mother, was standing off to the side as well. My mom nodded, thinking nothing of it. It was completely normal for kids to make friends at the park, and especially in an area so friendly. Besides, she found it likely that the older woman was with her and would be able to help if anything was happening. They proceeded to talk for a little bit longer before my mom thought to look over again to check up on us. When she glanced over to the swings, she saw Kristen, she saw my sister, but she no longer saw me. She stared for one more second as it sunk in, and she realized the older woman was also not there. Panic washed over her and she immediately alerted Kristen's mom. They rushed over, hoping I was just hiding behind the slide. My mom's eyes scanned over the playground, frantically trying to help me. She recalls Kristen's mom taking the other 2 girls by the hand, attempting to ask them what had just happened. But before either of them were able to offer any information, her eyes locked on me. The older woman had taken me by the hand and was leading me off of the playground, out of the gate, and into the parking lot. My mom began to run after her, not explaining a word, just yelling for her to stop. The woman did not pause, did not even turn around to acknowledge my mom's screams until she was close enough to reach out and grab my one free hand. My mom immediately began to curse and question what in God's name she was doing with me. The older woman began to explain how this was a misunderstanding, that she was only just walking me to the baseball field that was right across the street. Of course, this answer was completely unacceptable, and my mom was making this clear as Kristen's mom was quickly behind, catching up, coming to aid in whatever way she could. It appeared that when the older woman noticed Kristen's mom was there as backup, she let go of my hand and began to offer some semblance of an apology before hurrying to her car and quickly pulling away. And it was not until after she had already gotten down the street that my mom understood 2 suspicious details, which included the direction the older woman was walking me was towards her parked car and not at all towards the baseball field. And 2, the older woman did not put a child in the car before she left, meaning she came to a playground of kids by herself. I often ask my mom why she didn't call the police at this moment, and honestly, she doesn't have a good answer. She tells me that it was just shock, and I'm sure part of it was, but I also think that it could have partially been due to embarrassment. However, I hope it's not that at all. There's no way she could have expected this to happen, and she may have very well saved my life right at that moment, and I try to make it as clear to her as I can. While I'm into my 20s now, and this happened when I was like a toddler, I still think about it from time to time. At least, this recounted version my mom tells, and it's a terrifyingly scary idea to think that she wouldn't have seen me in time, and that I could have possibly had a completely different path in life. So the encounter took place a few years ago. I was living in a super huge apartment block, and quite a terrible one at that. One late afternoon, I was just chilling with my then girlfriend when I suddenly heard faint scratching noises outside the door. Definitely weird, but I dismissed it, thinking it's probably some neighborhood kiddos scratching walls with a key or some other stupid kid stuff sometimes that they do. A moment passed and the noise didn't disappear. Quite the opposite, it actually got louder. At this point, I started realizing what the sound was. It was the sound of a metal object scratching on my door's lock. I immediately get startled and went to look via the peephole. The longer corridor was half dark, and right there in front of my door, there was a man. I couldn't see his face too clearly, but I was 100% sure that I didn't know him. He was tinkering with the lock in some way, but with the peephole's limited field of view, I couldn't see what exactly he's doing. I made sure all the locks are, locked and backed off as it fell silent. Just as I was about to return to the living room, the door handle slowly moved down, pressed from the other side, and just as slowly returned to its initial position. I freaked out. I hurried to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I had, and squatted next to the door. It was locked, but if he'd managed to pick it, well, there I was, frightened and armed. For a moment, it fell silent again. Then the lever slowly went down and up again. More scratching, and the lever moved again. Then silence again. And then I heard a whisper. "Let me in." My heart skipped a beat, or a dozen of them probably. "Let me in. Let me in." If he was screaming, it would be just as frightening. But he wasn't. He was whispering to my door, repeatedly, "Let me in." I think I unfroze for a second because I grabbed my phone and called the security. The apartment block had the security, but they were stationed in a small booth outside of the block itself, which is huge, and I lived on the 8th floor, so it was a really long way to get there from their place, especially given that they were lazy idiots who usually just watch TV and smoke so much that there was a heavy fog inside of the booth. Still, I gave them a panic call, quickly explaining the situation. Sure enough, the guard laughed it off, saying the stranger is probably just some drunk neighbor. He told me that the other guard is on patrol and that he'll call him and tell him to come to my door. I have no idea why I didn't call the police, but I was probably just too frightened to think straight. The block was in the middle of nowhere, so the nearest police station was quite far away anyways. My girlfriend just kept observing, probably some kind of a stress reaction too. Seconds felt like hours, and after some time it fell silent, this time for good. 15 minutes later or so, the freaking security guy finally knocked on my door long after the guy was gone. Good job, man, seriously. Took your sweet time, thank you very much. He said that they will close the gate and check the camera footage, but he didn't look too tense, so I don't know if they actually did anything. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Maybe it was some drunk neighbor who left the elevator one floor too early or too late and thought his wife locked him out. Maybe he actually was some psycho or a junkie trying to purposely access my door. I'll never know, and I guess I prefer it this way. It was late summer and I was coming home from hanging out at the beach with my best friend Maya. It was her 17th birthday party. When I got off the subway at my stop, I looked at the bus arrival screen. The bus I would normally take home was arriving in about an hour. Being a tired 14-year-old girl, I decided to take an alternative bus route home. This was a decision I would later regret. When I got off the bus at the stop, I have about a 10-minute walk to my building. My area at night is pretty quiet, not many cars on the streets. As I'm walking up the street, I hear the sound of an engine nearby. I look over my left shoulder and see a white panel van. I know, right? How typical. It's rolling up the street. I try to think nothing of it, but when I turn onto my street, the van does too. Now I'm unsettled and start walking faster. The van is driving slowly and it never passes me. When I turn up the long driveway to my building, the van once again turns too, and now I start to feel scared. The driveway to my building has an ice rink on the side of it with bright lights. so I walk beside the rink under the bright lights. There are small houses on the other side of this driveway. The van catches up to me and stops. So I think maybe this person is lost and just trying to ask for directions. I was trying to find some way to rationalize this. I stop. I stay about 4 feet from the van just in case. I look in the van window to see an older man, starting to bald with black hair and a white t-shirt. I ask if they're lost and they don't respond. Instead, they try to get me into the van. I say no and start walking, but the van continues to drive slowly, following me. When a red car begins to drive down the driveway, the van drives all the way to the end of the driveway and waits for the red car to turn out before reversing to be beside me again. The man is still trying to get me into the van. I want to make a mad dash to my building, but I'm worried that he'll see where I live, so I keep walking. When another car comes down the driveway, the van does what it did before and drive to the end and wait for the car to leave. But this time there is a car dropping someone off at the townhouses. The cabbie is closing his trunk when he sees me. "You okay?" he asks. I tell him how the van had been following me, and every time a car comes, the van drives to the end and waits for it to leave before following me again. The cabbie tells me that he'll get in his car to drive to the end of the driveway and sit there for a bit so I have enough time to run to my building. I tell him okay and thank you. The van is back in line with me again, so the cabbie gets in his cab and drives up the driveway, and the van follows. I look and see the 2 vehicles sitting there. I ran up the rest of the driveway into my building's lobby, and my heart is racing. When I get to my apartment, I'm still freaked out. I go into my room and call the cops. While I'm on the phone with the cops, I look out of my bedroom window and see the van. It's slowly driving around my building looking for me. Now, I'm fully panicking. The cops send officers to sweep the area, but they don't find him. 2 officers came to my apartment and they get a statement from me. About a week after this happened, the officers come back to my apartment. They show me a photo of the man from the van that they were able to get from the security camera on the side of my building. I told them the man in the photo was the one that followed me. They told me that they were aware of this man and that he was already on an offender list. I'm a single male, 33 years old, who lives alone in Denver. My apartment complex is not what you would call a nice building. I'm on a road close to Colfax Avenue, which, if you're familiar with the geography of this area, is not the safest boulevard in town. I'm a few streets away from it, but close enough that I wouldn't consider this an up-and-coming neighborhood. This evening, I was watching Netflix on my couch. My 2 cats were cuddled up against me as I lay under a comforter. The night before, I was watching a horror movie that was scary enough to leave me in an unsettled mood, making it hard to sleep. So this night, I decided to watch a stand-up special instead. Keep it light so I wouldn't have any trouble getting some shut-eye. I have classes earlier the next morning, so I was surprised when I made the conscious decision to turn on a second stand-up special and let myself fall asleep on the couch. I was just so comfy where I lay and didn't want to move, not even to turn off the several lights on throughout the apartment. I remember dozing off at around 11 o'clock. It was effortless, which meant I was really snug under the covers with my cats flanking me on either end, creating a tucked-in feeling. I fell into a dream wherein I was on an impromptu date with this guy, whom I didn't recognize, at a Blockbuster video store. He bought me blue and yellow underwear, like a Blockbuster would sell in Dreamland, insinuating that I would take the hint of his intentions. He was also desperate for a job, so when we got to the counter, he was given an off-the-cuff interview that didn't go well. And all of a sudden, I'm not sleeping anymore. I'm woken up by a knock at my door. Then a man's voice saying, "Maintenance." I just sat there, sitting bolt upright on my couch. I knew something was off. I looked at my phone, which was by my left hand, and the time was 2:15 a.m. I didn't move. The floors in my apartment are old wood, and there are many creaky floorboards. I didn't want whoever was knocking to know someone was at home and awake, let alone alert to his presence. My cats got up and ran over to the door as they normally would, but I stayed still and listened. After a few minutes with no answer, the man walked away from the door and down the hallway to the stairs. A moment after that, I heard the back door to the building swing open and closed. I have one window where I had a partial view of that door, so I braked my paralysis and ran over to it. I saw an old-looking green SUV sitting in the no parking zone just in front of the back door. It must have been running the entire time because I didn't hear it start up, and the brake lights were glowing red. Someone, presumably the maintenance man, got in the car and it drove off. I don't know what his intentions were, but no one knocks on someone's door at 2:15 a.m. claiming to work for the landlord with good deeds in mind. Had it been a true emergency, wouldn't he have knocked again, used his service key to get in the unit? What did I just avoid here? I can only assume it was an attempted robbery at best or abduction at worst. When I was watching the SUV drive off, I surveyed the other apartment windows. They were all dark. I can see every unit except the two other corner apartments below me from that vantage point. I think because my apartment sticks out from the building and has many windows, that I was targeted because my lights were visibly on and noticeable from the street. However, I don't know how this individual got into the building in the first place, as you would need a key to do so. I've never been so legitimately afraid as a single person living alone. I'm grateful I installed a security chain on my door when I moved in. I'm also so grateful that, even in my disoriented state, I had the presence of mind not to move from the couch or make any noise. As I recount the event, I can't stop my eyes from leaking tears, though I wouldn't call it crying. My nerves are definitely shot. I don't think I'll be going back to Dreamland anytime soon. I have turned off all the lights save for the lamp by my bed. I usually can't sleep with it on. Tonight, I don't think I could sleep with it off. Last night I took some melatonin to get to sleep early. I have an American bully who is scared of everything, so I don't think of her as my protector. I feel that I'm her protector, and I'm fine with that. My boyfriend works late, so she usually barks when she hears the garage open. At 10:55, she started going crazy. At first, I told her to go back to bed. I then heard my doorbell going off excessively and knocking. We never use our front door, and not once have we ever entered through our front door. We use the garage. My first thought was my boyfriend's garage opener must have been broken or something, but I had no calls or texts from him. My dog was still going insane. We live in a little gated community, so I don't ever really feel unsafe. I go down and my dog's with me. I can see through the peephole because I'm really short, and I heard someone screaming, "Help me," and they were still knocking and using the doorbell. I thought my boyfriend was just playing a trick on me. We have one of those hotel-like locks at the top of the door so you can open it like 2 inches without really opening it. I unlocked the deadbolt and doorknob and opened it, and a man was saying, "Help me," and then started jerking the knob. I screamed, "What do you need help with?" He wouldn't speak. He just kept jerking the doorknob while my dog is sounding the meanest I'd ever heard. I slammed the door with all my strength and lock it back up. I'm yelling that I'm going to call the cops. While on the phone, he's still ringing the doorbell and beating on the door, and 911 couldn't even hear it. I felt bad because I wasn't sure if they were hurt, but why wouldn't they say something when the door was open? Why didn't my dog's bark faze them at all? He stays beating on the door until the cops get there, and when they get there, I see them put an elderly man in the back of their car. I find out that it's my neighbor across the street that I've never met and barely seen. Apparently, he has dementia and got out of his house. I have a feeling of such guilt for calling the police and scaring his wife. I also felt stupid for how scared I was. I watch a lot of true crime shows, and my boyfriend has an important job and sometimes isn't home until about 4 a.m., so I immediately thought that someone was watching me and knew that I was home alone. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but it was so scary in the moment, and now I feel kind of silly and feel like if it was someone trying to hurt me, I did the wrong thing by opening the door a little, even though it was still locked. I just keep telling myself I did the right thing because what was I supposed to do when All I knew was a strange man was at my door acting erratically and trying to get in my house. I feel bad for his wife and that the cops made him take an ambulance to the ER to get checked out. Either way, that was my creepy encounter for 2022, and hopefully for the rest of my life. I'm a 20-year-old female and I moved in my own place in the city about 3 months ago. And first time living on my own, and I'm in the heart of downtown trying to pursue acting. I have 2 neighbors down the hall, both male. One is maybe around 40 and the other is somewhere around 70 to 80. We'll call the 40-year-old 40 and the 70-year-old 70 to keep it simple. Okay, these 2 have been fighting non-stop for the past 2 weeks. Like 40 is banging on 70's door yelling his name, saying stuff like, "You stop yelling," or "Open this door and you stop being terrible," all these sorts of names that I can't repeat here, and 70 will literally make threats like, "Stop banging my door, I'll kill you and your family," and starts loudly mocking the noise of the knocking. Anyhow, when I first moved here, 40 kept asking if I was single or married. I do have a boyfriend, so obviously I told him that. And he within seconds went from trying to flirt and being kind to literally just angry and telling me to get my dog to stop licking his shoes or whatever, and just storms off. Fast forward a week and he sees me and asks me again. Again, I tell him I have a boyfriend and he calmly says, "Nah, that's okay. I feel you, girl." So I walked off, and again a couple of days ago, this time a lot weirder, he says, "Hey, you know I was in love with you, right?" And I responded saying like, "No, I didn't. We barely ever speak." And he asked if I had lost my man yet. I told him no, and he asked if I was sleeping around. I said no, and he asked how many people I've been with. I asked him why he was asking personal questions to a stranger, and he insisted that meant that I slept with a lot of people. I didn't want him to think that I was easy to get at, so I simply told him that I'd had 2 boyfriends, and I only slept with people I was dating. He stormed off and said, "That's a lie." And I asked him what led him to believe that I was lying. He turned around and told me that 70 had told him I had been sleeping with him. This was obviously not true, and he said I just didn't want to share the love because he was black, and I told him I just didn't want to share the love with anyone I wasn't dating in general. And he got mad and stormed off yelling, "I'll show you how to share the love someday, girl." And later that night he came past my apartment after yelling at 70 and just said my name by my door. I don't know how to interpret it. My mom wants me to request out of my lease and move into a house down the road. My boyfriend wants me to move in with him, and everyone thinks I should leave. I don't know if it's creepy or what he even meant by it, but one of my sisters said it would be good to post on here and get others' views, so here goes. I'd like to add, I don't just go around giving away my name. Everyone in my unit knows me because I work at the grocery store literally down the road. I didn't think the people in this new building would be so different from the people in the last. Back in the summer of 2020, I was 14 and I would spend a lot of time with my cousin. We both loved going on walks and would always walk in the neighborhood near her house. One night I was spending the night over and we decided to go on a walk. It was around 10 p.m., and I'd like to be precise that the roads weren't well lighted, so it was very dark. We were used to doing that, so we weren't too scared at all. But while we were walking, a white Jeep started driving very close to us. The guy who was driving lowered his window, and there was another guy with him, and they both seemed to be at around 25 years old. The guys were just weirdly staring at us for like 2 minutes. Then the guy in the passenger seat started asking weird questions like, "Aren't you girls scared of the dark?" And after asking this, he drove away. Me and my cousin were relieved, thinking that this was just a joke, but unfortunately we noticed the Jeep's lights on the road, and it seemed like they were going back and forth before coming to our level again, and this time it was the guy in the passenger seat who talked, and he asked if we wanted to ride home, then said, "We will take care of you," while smiling, and it was at this moment my cousin's eyes opened wide, and after that they drove away again. Me and my cousin were petrified that we couldn't even speak. We were still hearing that Jeep, so we didn't want to run home because we were afraid that they would follow us. We hid inside a garden behind trees for about 10 minutes. The Jeep came back, but fortunately they didn't see us. We didn't have our phones because we usually don't take them on walks. When the lights disappeared, we sprinted home. We got there and cried quite a bit. And my cousin told me that she got so scared because she had noticed that there was a knife and some sort of pills in the back seat. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Houston. Some people talk about neighborhoods where people don't lock their doors. This wasn't that kind of neighborhood. Situations in Houston notoriously went from 0 to 100 quickly, so while the neighborhood was basically quiet, doors were locked and checked religiously. That being said, 90% of the time the big neighborhood problems would be teens vandalizing or car break-ins. Annoying, but not really terrifying. I worked retail at a clothing store that closed at 9. I worked with a woman I was getting to be friends with who asked if I could give her a ride home. It was a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. Her neighborhood was pretty sketchy. I don't know if it has anything to do with what happened later, but I drove her to her apartment, and we sat in the car and chatted until she was ready to head inside. I sat in the car to watch her go inside. Around me, other residents were outside drinking and just shooting the breeze. It was around 10, so it would have been late for my neighborhood to be outside talking at a volume like this on a weeknight, but it was expected at this place, so I didn't think much of it. When she got inside, she blinked the lights a couple of times to let me know she was in safe and I headed for my childhood home. I should note that this was a time before cell phones, so this was kind of a basic routine. I was to call her from my house once I was home and everyone would be confirmed safe. I don't remember the drive home really. I probably blasted tunes and sang along as I usually did and parked in the driveway. The outside lights were on. Mom was good about turning them on for me, so I went inside without fuss. Now, a note about my parents. They weren't really mean drunks, but they were alcoholics. They still functioned okay by day, but it wasn't uncommon for me to arrive upon a scene as I did that night with all the lights on, the TV going, and Mom passed out on the couch. Dad was presumably in the bedroom or passed out in his man cave. From experience, I also knew if I turned off the lights or the TV, Mom would wake up and be grouchy about me waking her up, so I left everything as it was and headed to the bathroom to brush my teeth and wash up for bed. Once in my room, changed for bed, I called my friend to let her know I was home and all was well. One of my more annoying habits is that it's almost impossible for me to end a conversation. I'm incredibly tired and just want to read a book or something, but instead was just rambling at each other about work things or whatever. I had already gotten to bed and turned the lights out. I was just laying in bed in the dark listening to my friend rambling. My room was at the front of the house. It had a weird wall in front of the window, some stylistic mid-century modern thing that didn't make a lot of sense, but did block out some of the light from headlights when cars passed. Ours wasn't a highly trafficked area, but cars driving by in a square pattern of light on the upper part of the wall wasn't an unusual sight. What was unusual, though, were specific beams of light bouncing around the upper part of the wall to the ceiling, and I stared at them for a moment before realizing that they were flashlights. That was highly unusual, but I figured it was just kids. I wasn't the sort of kid that other kids bullied or pranked. We never had our house TP'd, and I couldn't imagine anyone that would want to now that we'd all been graduated. I really needed to sleep because I had college finals the next day, and yet flashlights were around the house, and it was super weird. I really needed to sleep because I had college finals the next day, and yet flashlights around the house was super weird. My friend told me to call the police, but for a variety of reasons, I'm just not a fan. Besides, carrying flashlights in my front yard isn't a crime, so I couldn't even imagine what the police would do. I see well in the dark, and besides, the lights in the living room were still on, so still on the phone, but without turning on any extra lights, I got up and with the intent to check the front door. I really don't remember how long my friend and I were on the phone rambling. It had to be a while for what happened next to have happened. I get to the living room and I hear something in the kitchen. It's this weird metallic slapping sound that makes no sense at all. I tell my friend and she continues to caution me to call the police, but for what? Flashlights? Metal sounds? The kitchen lights are also on, so you have to picture it. A barely lit living room with a woman passed out on the couch. The TV is on. The kitchen lights are on, but not the dining room. But for all intents and purposes, this looked like a house where people are awake. Except for my mom, who's very clearly dead to the world. So I head towards the sound. At the very end of the kitchen, there is a smallish window with metal blinds. The blinds are closed, but they're rattling, making that weird metallic slapping noise, and I think, is the window open? We're not a window-opening people. I know some people in the South open their windows on a nice evening, but that's not us. Sometimes windows are open temporarily when Mom would pass out while cooking dinner and something burned, but it was always for a very fixed time. It was possible that she left the window open, but unlikely, so I just stood there, staring at it, head cocked like a curious dog. And then I saw the front of a shoe on the sill. I screamed. Actually, just saying that I screamed way understates the noise that I made. I'm a notorious low talker, and I assumed that I'd just been saving all that volume for this precise moment. I wailed. I cried. I keened. I became a banshee and threw all my power into my voice in this mighty force. The foot immediately vanished. My mom woke. My friend screamed on the phone with me. From the back of the house, my dad came bounding out with his gun. I got off the phone and called the police. I grabbed another gun and headed outside behind my dad. I'm not a gun person, and going outside was super stupid, but the scream to end all screams had apparently done its job, as no one was there. Being kind of an expert in criminology due to watching police shows, I told everyone to stay away from the sill so the police could investigate it. I had visions of them taking fingerprints and molding the shoe prints to find the culprit. It was an adorable thought. The police arrived half an hour later, so it's good we weren't actually under attack. In the meantime, my mom started to doubt that I'd seen anything and started to believe that she'd left the window open. But no, the police verified that the window had been pried open, that whomever it was very carefully took all the bric-a-brac that decorated the sill and set it on the ground, as if trying to remain very quiet. At no point before this did I consider what the invaders' plan was. Maybe it was shock or lack of imagination or just being tired, but they knew it was a full house and they were sneaking in. These weren't robbers who just wanted to take some electronics for quick cash. They were going to take us by surprise. To do what, though? Thoroughly chilled, I asked when they were going to take fingerprints, and the cops basically laughed me off because nothing was stolen. We locked down the windows, and I stayed up all night trying not to imagine what exactly those people were going to do to us. About 5 to 6 years ago, I was working at a gas station, and I ran into a girl I recognized from high school. She was with her boyfriend, who was a regular in the store. I distinctly remembered him because he wore this really cool-looking horn-rimmed glasses. We got to talking and I asked him if he wanted to get together and smoke a bit. He agreed and said that he'd wait for me after he dropped off his girlfriend. So, end the shift is around 11 p.m. and he comes, and he's outside waiting and tells me that he knows a really cool smoke spot. I follow him in my car to said smoke spot, and we end up in a gravel lot surrounded by various RVs and trailers. I didn't think much of it because it seemed pretty safe and out of the way from police. We smoke a bit, and afterwards he invited me to his place, and since I was pretty baked, I said, screw it, why not? Dude leads me to this really dark neighborhood and takes me to a house that he enters from the basement that leads into a nice room. Except for the fact that it had nothing but a bed and a TV. Did I mention that there were plastic sheets around the TV and near the bed? The hair stood on the back of my neck like I was in danger, and when he asked if I wanted to sit on the bed, I politely declined and said it was about time for me to go home. He then asked me if I wanted to smoke another one before heading out, and Being the young fiend that I was, I said alright, but I also insisted on being outside. He invited me to his car to roll up and smoke. Now, I was already on edge, maybe from the weed, but I'll maintain it was my sixth sense. And when the guy turns the radio on, he turns on some music from the early 1900s. Really couldn't tell you what decade. The type of stuff you hear in serial killer movies, and starts going on and on about how it was his favorite music. I asked him if he was going to roll up or not because I was really only there to smoke before I left and he still hadn't started. So he pulls out the wrap and pulls out a knife, and the second I saw the handle, I bolted. I'm talking fastest I've ever run back to my car. I locked the doors and turned the ignition on before he could even get out of the car. I screeched my wheels, peeling out of the neighborhood. I never spoke to him again. I swear I met a serial killer that night and I just barely managed to get away. What do you guys think? Was I just tripping balls?
Hello, Mr. X. My name is Chris. The story I want to share with you and the Dreamers took place many years ago when I was living in Washington State. It was a hot summer, right after the end of my senior year of high school. We just got some relief due to a couple nights of good, heavy rain. Normally, this would have been a welcome change, but this time it really got in the way of a paintball trip my best friend Garth and I had been planning for our post-graduation shenanigans. Garth was spending the summer with my family and me out on our rural farm in Snohomish, Washington. We had 5 acres on a huge hill, most of it fenced off into a pasture for livestock like horses, sheep, and cows. When the rains came through, the hillside turned into muck, and my gravel driveway became a serious hazard. My mother had managed to get her truck stuck in it pretty often, so naturally, that happened when we were trying to get out one day. Seeing that catastrophe, Garth decided that he would try to squeeze his Firebird out past my mom's truck before the driveway deteriorated any further. His plan was to park somewhere overnight and sleep in his car, just to make sure we would be able to leave on time for our trip in the morning. He asked me to come keep him company because, according to him, he didn't want to be a black guy sleeping in a car in the middle of BFE. Even though I could have easily stayed in the house myself, it seemed the good friend thing to do, so I agreed. We gathered up a couple of blankets, some sodas and snacks, and our paintball gear, and went out to his car. He maneuvered his way past the useless husk of my mom's stranded Chevy truck. It took a bit of doing, but eventually, we got out of the driveway and rumbled on down the road. Our first thought was to keep close to home. We decided to park alongside the corner store near the bottom of the hill. We knew the owners well and spent a good chunk of our pocket cash there, on comics, ice cream, and the occasional girly magazine. So we figured if we got caught camping out in the car there, they'd be pretty cool about it. Unfortunately, we initially forgot about the number of times the windows and signs of the store had been shot out. Lots of little vandals out and about at night around there. When the thought occurred to me, we decided to relocate. Stray bullets aside, the store is built next to the old foundation of one of the first one-room schools in the valley. The place was pretty spooky at night anyway. We drove around a bit before pulling into the gravel parking lot of an old roadside barn. It was around 11 p.m. The rain actually slowed down a bit, leaving that eerie, misty gloom in its wake. You probably know the scene I'm talking about. A foggy road lined with woods on either side is not the best place to be sleeping in a car. It was too quiet. The barn's peaked roof was silhouetted by a nearly full moon against an overcast, dusky sky. Just behind it, about 10 or 15 meters to our left, was a steep embankment that dropped into a deep, dark gully that absolutely exuded creepiness. Despite all that, we actually stayed there. Honestly, it was a pretty good time at first. We joked around, drank a few sodas, plowed through our snack cakes and beef jerky supply, etc. Before too long, sleep had begun sneaking up on us. We shrouded ourselves with the fleece blankets we brought. I checked the door locks and dismissed the fact that I could no longer see through the fogged up windows, not seeing the otherwise haunting surroundings. actually made it a bit more comfortable. Sleeping in a Firebird was already painful enough without the extra visuals. I wouldn't recommend it either way. I woke up a few hours later, catching the tail end of an unsettling noise coming from outside. I didn't hear enough of it to tell quite what it was, but I did hear enough to instantly have my senses alerted. It was like what I'd imagine I'd feel after hearing the howl of a predator, signaling to its companions, or the crackling of something stalking in the bush behind me. The windows had cleared up, revealing the gaping black maw of the gully that lingered just past the back lot where the old barn stood. The void seemed to almost pull our car towards itself. I shook off the initial creep factor of the strange noise, resituated my blanket, and eventually dozed back off to sleep. Minutes later, I was awakened again. My ears were suddenly overwhelmed with the most horrible cacophony of noise I'd ever experienced. My primal brain activated instantly, sending my system into fight or flight mode. I looked over at Garth to find him sitting straight up in his seat, eyes wide and face as ghostly pale as his brown skin would allow. The sound in my ears was unrelenting. I asked him, "Do you hear that?" He nodded, or at least I think he did, and we began scrambling around the cabin of the car, flinging the blankets off to double-check the locks. The sound got louder, closer, as if whatever the source was, it was clambering up the embankment below. It was absolutely awful. As I recall it, it seemed to be some twisted combination of canine barking or whining, and some other, unknown yet godforsaken creature with a disturbingly exotic range of vocal abilities. It warbled, cracked, and screeched in what was clearly a fit of pure, unadulterated madness. Of all the wild and or domesticated animal calls and sounds I had heard in all my years living in the valley, I had never heard anything approaching that. Garth fumbled with his keys while my eyes darted between the gully and the tree line. He struggled to get the key into the ignition, pushing through the fear-induced tremors in his hands. When the noises finally reached a crescendo, the Firebird's V8 engine roared to life, and the tires blew a shower of gravel behind the car as we hauled ass out of there. It was at that moment that my fears were confirmed. As we got further away from the location, the sound faded. That meant to me that the noise was not just in our heads, that there was something actually coming after us. We skidded down the twisted road back to my house. I knew we wouldn't be able to make it up the hill with all that mud flowing down. It wasn't worth trying and getting stuck, or even worse. At the same time, we didn't want to park somewhere out in the open either. We decided to head all the way into town and park out in front of my grandparents' bed and breakfast, where we sat wide-eyed until morning. My friends and I continued to hear those bizarre, haunting noises periodically throughout the rest of the summer. We even stumbled across an abandoned campsite in the woods, not far from the barn, where this originally happened. I could tell the place was a homeless camping spot of some sort, but we never saw anyone in the woods around there before. From where it was, we would have clearly seen it from the road in all the times that we've passed through that area, if people had been there. One night, I heard a motorcycle crash that was immediately followed by the bellowing sound of these howling things, as we took to calling them. Another night, my friends told me they were chased off the field they were using to play a paintball game. They said the noise was coming toward them, so they called me up on the walkie-talkies we used to use. I heard the familiar, terrifying sound again with my own ears, coming through the speaker. That was the only summer any of us heard those things. No one ever caught a glimpse of whatever they were, or even managed to identify any specific sounds among the madness. We never heard anything like that before or since. Anyway, thanks for listening, Mr. X. Sincerely, Chris.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, we're not window people.